The self-critical, internal self-esteem will always set the anti-psychotic direction of the psyche development. The theatrical, external self-esteem, for reasons which I have presented earlier, will in turn patronize the opposite, that's the psychotic tendency. In other words, the development of the anxiety emotional intelligence during childhood contributes to the growth of the self-critical internal self-esteem, enabling during the adolescence the exit from the primary psychosis. And in the maturity, anxiety emotional intelligence has a protective effect against the risk of a psychotic outbreak. And if such an outbreak does occur, the higher the anxiety in the emotional intelligence, the better the prognosis of the evolution of the psychotic episode. In the case of an unfavorable result of the mental maturation, with the lack of a sufficiently high anxiety, emotional intelligence, high enough to get out of the primary psychosis, the phenomenon of the pathognomonic psyche stiffness of the primary psychosis is only, it seems, a secondary process. Secondary to what? Secondary to the psychoticization of the external self-esteem, as I have described this process before. The psyche here becomes stiffened in a manner typical to all psychoses in accordance with the principle that there is no psychosis without a rigid psyche. But the stiffness is nevertheless the result of a primal psychotic process that is more or less extensive. This process, however, regardless the punctual it is, in the case of external self-esteem psychoticization, strangely blocks the flexibility of the rest of the psyche. We always see an evident mental rigidity when we meet a psychotic person. Only careful observation allows us to notice the symptoms of a more detailed psychotic disorder of the psychotic type. These can be symptoms of insanity, disordered thinking, paranoia, or even hallucinations affecting all senses, or symptoms of a psychotic external self-esteem. However, all these symptoms are always accompanied by the mental stiffness. The mental rigidity is absent in the case of the anxiety and the depressive disorders unless there comes to a natural healing process by an inadequate therapy. A natural healing, yes, as I wrote before, it involves the reactivation of the primary psychosis. It involves the reaction of the anti-anxiety mechanism of the primary psychosis. A poorly treated depression enters then the phase of the psychosis, which is known the psychiatric nomenclature of so far as the melancholic psychosis. However, this is not a correct name for it because it's just a simple reactivation of the primary psychosis and must be called like that. Let's note that the very intriguing consequences of the discussion on the issue of the mental maturation. Here we have a picture in which 10 to 25% of the human population grows out of the primary psychosis and will henceforth be exposed primarily to the anxiety disorders and related to them the depressive disorders. But unfortunately, these 10 to 25% of the population will not avoid the reactivation of the primary psychosis as a complication of the poorly treated or untreated anxiety and depressive disorders. Meanwhile, 75 to 90% of humanity, the people who never come out of the primary psychosis, will be protected forever by this primary psychosis against the anxiety or the depressive disorders. What's more, a rigid psyche, that's a routine, reproductive, task-oriented, unreflective, uncritical, and also low emotional psyche. Psyche rigidity means impoverishment of its functions in all aspects. This low emotional psyche causes a state of a high self-satisfaction. It's hardly surprising when there is no anxiety and no emotions, when there is no self-critical doubt, and the theatrical external self-esteem inflates more and more wonderful ideas about oneself, it's hard to feel more blessed. Yes, it means detachment from the reality. But isn't that a price worth paying when we gain so much? As long as the primary psychosis does not go excessively, because it must go, beyond the framework of the proper interpersonal and social relations, so long, despite the price of childishness, mental rigidity, and zero creativity, sticking to one's own or borrowed patterns, the social functioning is possible. Such a psychologically obscure niche in which not less than 75 to 90% of the modern society resides. Actually, the primary psychosis and the consequent persistent mental immaturity in its moderate forms is a psychic constitution that provides a specific kind of happiness. Namely, it will inevitably be happiness in isolation, happiness in its own cage of happiness, in a cage completely cut off from the anxiety and the emotional realities of the human psyche. Hence, the misleading impression of an autistic streak. And there is no question of any even mildest form of autism. In the primary psychosis, the consciousness is cut off from the anxiety and the emotional stimuli by a psychotic mechanism, a mechanism as old as humanity. In the autism, on the other hand, there is no development of the consciousness at all in the case of the complete autism. And in the case of the autistic streak, the developmental process of the consciousness of the first month of life is delayed. It's difficult not to ask why the human psyche, in the course of evolution, develop a mechanism of recovery from the primary psychosis, if from the point of view of psychological comfort, living with the primary psychosis is infinitely more convenient, as I described above. But about this in next lecture. Thank you.